Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our first guest speaker, Dr. Jason Pontius. He's the Associate Chief Academic Officer for the Iowa Board of Regents. He joined the board in 2012 and has held prior positions at Iowa State University, the Iowa Department of Education, the University of Maryland at College Park, and Wesleyan College. His expertise includes institutional research, assessment, and evaluation, data management, and college administration across academic and student affairs. He holds a PhD in higher education policy from Iowa State University, along with degrees from Indiana University and the University of Virginia. Today, he'll be joining us to talk about college outcomes using data to track earnings, retentions, and return on investment. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Jason.
All right, well, thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here today. A few things to know about me beyond my introduction is I have the privilege of working with Greta Rouse, the Iowa Board of Regents. Part of my job is to keep her and other board members informed about kind of current trends in the data for students and other things that are affecting our universities. At the Board of Regents, we represent 3 public universities in the state, so that's Iowa State, University of Iowa, and the University of Northern Iowa. I serve as the institutional researcher for the Board of Regents office, but I'm also the liaison for our statewide longitudinal data system, kind of representing all the data from our universities, and work closely with K-12, community college, college aid, and also workforce development. Now, another thing to know about me is I tend to do data storytelling, and I do a lot of storyboarding with it. I don't put a lot of text in. I do a lot of images because honestly, data otherwise is pretty darn boring. And so I want you to kind of hang on because I'll be flipping through slides sometimes fairly quickly. The first thing I will say is I really don't like the title of my presentation, and that's my own fault because I picked it. And the problem is it's a self-inflicted wound because Mary gave me a whole bunch of different possible AI ChatGPT suggestions for titles. And once I finished my presentation, I'm like, these are all better. But this is my only mention of AI for this presentation. I won't go into a lot of that. What I will be talking about are the different kinds of data that we have available to us. Most of it's public. If it's not public, it's readily available. And we're trying to answer some of the really tough questions that are facing higher ed. For example, why is the college-going rate for college graduates dropping? Or so for high school graduates dropping? How will my state be impacted by the enrollment cliff? What's the impact of dual enrollment or concurrent enrollment on our colleges? Is a college degree worth the expense and the debt? And are college degrees aligned with my state's workforce needs? To get at some of that, I'm going to be focusing quite a bit on the US Census PSEO, but there are other sources of data that I'm going to be bringing to bear here. Oftentimes, we're bringing them in combination. I'd like to say that any of these different sources provides kind of like a definitive answer for the questions that we have before us, and some of them do. But for the most part, we're triangulating. We're using data in different ways to look at the same problem to try to get some of the answers to what's plaguing us. In a lot of cases, we can identify what's not happening, but not always what is happening, and I'll talk through some of that as we go. So first, I love the visuals here. This is perfect clickbait. This is the sort of stuff you probably have read many articles about the enrollment cliff. And if you're not familiar with the enrollment cliff, essentially it boils down to during the Great Recession, we had a decline in the birth rate. That was about 18 years ago. So those high school graduate cohorts are now getting ready to go to college, and it's going to be affecting us overall. Now, my favorite headline is the one from Forbes, "The Cliffs of Higher Ed, Who's Going Over and Why?" Now, I make light of this. These are a little bit exaggerated, but this is serious stuff. There are colleges that are going to fail, and there are some that have already failed, kind of anticipation of this happening. So Nathan Graw put forth this idea, or started looking at the demographic data, and predicted that starting right about now, we're getting ready for about a 15% drop in the number of high school graduates. This is the pool of students that we have. The problem is that this is not uniform across all states or across all types of institutions. You may have seen that there's a record number of applications for universities like UCLA, which I think has over 100,000, maybe 120,000 applications each year. University of Wisconsin-Madison last year was 70,000. I think they're getting closer to 80 for this incoming class. So there's some of these colleges, particularly some of the public flagships, that are really getting a lot of interest. They provide usually good value and good brand name. So we were trying to understand what the impact was going to be for Iowa, and this is if you take Nathan Graw's data and apply it to Iowa, it's what you get. This is kind of a classic sawtooth. This is usually what happens when you have too little data trying to make predictions for kind of future trends. And it's not in any way a knock on what Nathan Graw was doing. He was using American Community Survey data, which was excellent. However, for a small state like Iowa, it does not do a very good job of predicting what's happening. And the clue for how to fix this for us came from when we were talking to our K-12 folks about how do we, talking about how this big cliff was coming, and they're like, well, it's funny, we're not seeing that in our K-12 data. I'm like, well, you should be. So we went back and looked at it. And the trick is, if you want to predict the future for college enrollment or high school graduation rates, you go back in time. And it turns out one of the best ways of doing that is looking at your first graders. So you take your first graders, you figure out what percentage of them are going to make it to a high school graduation. We applied some other statistical work to that, and we came up with this estimate instead. So at least for the state of Iowa, we're not quite so dire. We're actually at our worst going to go back to the 2022 levels of enrollment. And so this is something that we can then provide to our board, provide to our universities, and help them make plans. And this is a kind of a measure for how well it's predicting. So the red line here is showing the actual high school graduates and kind of the trends there. So we know that we were on the right track with this kind of prediction. The problem, and where this all gets really messy, is we can't predict the other states, or we could talk about our state. Fortunately, there are groups like WICHE that are using similar methodologies to kind of look at different kinds of high school graduates for each particular state. One of the things that's worrying for Iowa is the state of Illinois is predicted to drop 24% of their high school graduating class. We get most of our out-of-state students from the state of Illinois. But we're able to use some of this data to then pivot, and so our admissions offices are starting to look at states like Texas, where we have a large population and are expected to have some growth. Now that was talking about the pool of students. The one that really scares me is we're seeing nationally, and Iowa's no exception, a drop in the percent of students of choosing to go to college. So of that pool, what's the rate of going to college? This is just a sample from our post-secondary readiness reports, but actually if you go back to class of 2012, we had about 72% of our students were going on to college, our high school graduates going straight to college. For next year, we're looking at about 59% going straight to college. And we've spent a fair amount of time trying to understand all the factors that go into it. And we can talk about some, but one of the big ones, probably the elephant in the room, is just the cost of college. It's not easy. It's very easy to look at the media in some of these articles, and what they do is they tend to emphasize things like the $100,000 cost per year for college. They look at NYU, they look at George Washington University, they look at the Ivy Leagues, and they might, if they're feeling generous, offer like University of Michigan or University of Virginia, which last year I think were $72,000 for the full cost of attendance out of state. What College Board is looking at here is that actually, when you adjust it for inflation, some of those the tuition and fees have gone down in the last few years. And there may be some of you in the room saying, I don't buy it. And I get that. I was helping my kid kind of go through the college search last year, and you keep seeing the prices, and they're considerably more than what I was going through. And actually, I share something with our other presenter. We both have a student who just finished a first year at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. One of the things I want to talk about, because it gets into our overall kind of return on investment conversation later, is what we tend to see in the news, and a lot of you know this already, is we talk about the cost of attendance. So that's the sticker price for these colleges. That's the top line showing there for public universities. If you go down to, I want to focus on what is listed here as net cost of attendance, is often known as net price. That's that sticker price minus any kind of money that a student doesn't have to pay back. So that's grants and scholarships. That looks at the average grants and scholarship for the student. More and more of schools are trying to provide discounts through merit aid. And for example, like in the private schools right now, I think the discount rate is about 56% of cost of attendance. In addition to that, there are one of the reasons I think that the inflation-based tuition fees has gone down is a lot of schools since the pandemic have frozen tuition or are actively trying to ratchet their tuition down. In other cases, they're even reducing the overall tuition that they charge. So that's talking about cost, but we're also, whether it's the cost or other things that are affecting it, we can look at our postgraduate intent data. This is through the Iowa Department of Ed. They can see, or they survey all students when they're getting ready to graduate and see what their intentions are afterward. We didn't used to think this data was very good because anybody can say anything when they're getting ready to walk across the stage. But it turns out while the numbers can be a little bit off, the trends have been very accurate over the years. What we're seeing in Iowa is a movement away from the community colleges, which is unexpected. We thought more people would be going to the community colleges and the kind of the workforce outcomes you can get there. The public 4 years have been relatively stable, and we're seeing a pretty big decline in the 4-year privates, which is causing quite a bit of concern. We have some of our small privates that are 25% down in enrollment as of from 0.5-6 years ago. And these are small colleges for the most part, and even a small change can make a big difference to their bottom line. Now, what you may have noticed is the purple line showing employment. That number of the people who are planning on going straight into the workforce out of high school has been climbing fairly rapidly. What's problematic is this is happening nationally as well. What's problematic is the gap, basically the missing college students. Employment's only filling about half of that. So we have still a sizable hole of students that had been going to college that are not going to college now and are also not indicating that they're planning on working or going into the workforce. We don't know exactly what's happening with them. One of the clues is looking in the state is we have an increased number of free and reduced lunch, students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, and the folks that have higher values of free and reduced lunch are less likely to go to college. This is a lot of squiggly lines, but I want to kind of break it down to, on the left are non-free and reduced lunch qualified students, on the right are students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, and we have male and female. Particular focus on the male students. Those rates have been declining. Now you may be saying this is due to the pandemic. This is pre-pandemic numbers here. These trends end in 2019. And what's particularly interesting is white and black men are the ones least likely to go to college or kind of gradually declining over time. And if you look at the purple line on the far right, the lowest college going rates that we have in Iowa right now are students who qualify for free and reduced lunch, are white, and are male. This is not just an Iowa thing. So the University of Michigan does a survey of high school graduates, and they ask them lots of questions. But one of the questions they ask is, are you likely or somewhat likely to pursue a 4-year degree? And the gap between males and females has been about 7 percentage points, as you can see all the way across the line. Starting around 2016, that has moved to double. Don't know exactly why that's happening. Again, we've talked about the failure to launch. I see that with my son's cohort of friends. But it's a little bit of a mystery that we kind of need to dig into more and more. One of the other questions I get when we talk about declining enrollment in our public universities, or in our privates as well, but at higher ed in the state of Iowa is, well, they're leaving, they're going out of state. We can use the National Student Clearinghouse data to track our high school grads to see where they're going. And we've been very consistently for the last 10 or 12 years been about 86 or 87% retention within the state. That is not where we are losing the students. We even provide some tracking as far as individual states. So these are students that chose to attend a 4-year public university in another state. The big line there is South Dakota. We've been tracking that partly because South Dakota started offering reciprocity for Iowa residents. But we found we can see the high schools that those students are coming from. And actually, there are 2 South Dakota universities that are closer to their home than Iowa State, which would be the furthest western, which is very centrally located in Iowa. We really don't have a public university presence in western Iowa. So this makes sense. You're going to the nearby school, and if you're getting in-state tuition there, it makes it worthwhile. One of the other questions we've been dealing with is dual enrollment. In Iowa, we have some of the most robust dual enrollment options. We have high participation rates across the state. And what I'm showing here are kind of our trend lines for different kind of levels of credit. And you can see there's been some growth in kind of like the red line, I think it's like 16 to 30. But there's actually been decline in the number of students with 6 to 15 credits or even 1 to 5. We are seeing more and more students coming to our universities with large numbers of college credits. You can see growth in there, particularly for the 45 to, I can't even read that very well, but I think it's the 46 to 65 credit hours. And my son graduated high school with 65 college credits. Hey, can he use all of it? That's another conversation we can talk about a little bit here too. Here are our trends for dual enrollment, and it's been going up quite a bit. It has leveled off in the last few years, maybe due to a certain degree of saturation. One of the things we try to look at is how does dual enrollment affect students? And one way it has been affecting them is our graduation rates for under 3 years have gone way up during the same time period. Now this is just the tip of the iceberg because we actually track the classes that students take in high school through our SLDS all the way into the classes that they're taking at the Regent universities. And we can even see things like they're more likely to get a minor, they're more likely to get a double major, they are more likely to retake classes that they took in high school. So if they took calculus in high school, I think it's about a 45% retake rate. And I honestly recommended that to my son because it's like high school calculus is very different from college calculus. It's going to move twice as fast and it's a very different environment. And students really seem to appreciate that. The problem is that I think the average person would say, oh, you got 65 college credits walking into college, you can graduate in 2 years. And that's just not how it works, particularly for engineering, which is what my son is majoring in. You often get your general electives taken care of, your general eds and your electives taken care of, which might get you 24 to 30 credits. We accept all of them, but not all of them can apply. And the most simple way we talk about that is you can only have so many 100-level courses count toward a 4-year degree. So I've been talking a lot about the kind of the typical things that boards of regents or state higher education boards track or colleges track, and that's enrollment, retention, graduation rates. But more and more we've been looking at what happens after the students leave our universities. And one of our best tools has been over the last few years, and this is only about a 5-year-old program, is the US Census Bureau's PSEO. This was started by David Troutman, University of Texas system, who is an Energizer bunny, if you have not met him. Tons of ideas and never seems to run out of energy or willingness to try new things. He basically called up the Census Bureau and said, we've only got unemployment insurance wage data for our state. You've got for 47 states. Can we match with you? And after a long period of going back and forth, they set that up, and then David went on the tour of talking to all these different organizations and all these different conferences saying, here's what you can do. So we joined up in 2021, got our data loaded in 2022. But we weren't the only ones. This is what the map of participation looked like for PSEO when I last talked about it at MEC back in Madison. Here's what it looks like today, and this is actually already out of date. We just added Idaho and New Jersey to this list as well. Now, it's a little bit tricky to look at this because it's not states participating. It's institutions participating, and it's usually, in most cases, like a board or a kind of the general higher ed agency that is participating. PSEO can't do MOUs with every single institution. There were 2 exceptions early on, and that was the University of Michigan, University of Wisconsin-Madison. But going forward, they work with systems. So what we've got is our data for Iowa from the Board of Regents. Our community college division, which is through our Iowa Department of Ed, has also got another one. So we've got all of our community colleges in the system as well. we are actively looking to add all of our privates too. We have 10 private colleges in the state of Iowa that are working with us. They're going to send the data to me. We're going to combine everything, strip all the identifiers, and send it out. There are three main things that scare people when they try to talk about looking at this, doing PSEO data. One of them is sharing SSNs, which is a requirement of it, the amount of work involved, and the fact that the data is public when you're done. The last part is people feel like they're losing control of their data and they worry about bad news. Particularly some of the humanities majors at our colleges were really kind of nervous about what are these wage outcomes going to look like for us. I can say that the SSN is handled very carefully. We're basically sharing a federal ID back to the feds. We keep it for about a week. We submit that data and then purge everything from our files. We do not want to store SSNs. We just do not. We're not in that business. And then it's immediately encrypted on the Census Bureau side. In addition to that, the data lift is actually pretty mild. There are 3 data files you have to send. They're very basic. They're mostly directory level data as far as FERPA's concerned, and with the exception of the SSN. And generally the news has been very positive. All of our majors met the Georgetown Center for Education and the Workforce kind of definition of good wages and kind of good jobs. So there's 2 main files that come out of this. One is the earnings data. And not only can you see earnings at the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile, you can see earnings at the 1, 5, and 10 years after college. I'm showing, and I will continue to show, mechanical engineering versus philosophy for all of I decided to pick those 2, mechanical engineering, because it's a robust, it's a great major, it's one of the more highly paid bachelor's degrees you can have, and philosophy because it's probably the most maligned. I could have picked history, but it's about the same numbers you're seeing there. Partly to show the numbers are good. Salary outcomes are strong. Obviously, you expect computer science and engineer majors to make a lot more money, but the humanities also tend to do very well. There are a few exceptions where I think our lowest overall time was classical literature. But they still, I'll talk about that a little bit later. PSEO also, because of all the participating organizations and universities, allows you to make some comparisons across institutions of higher ed. There's some danger to that because some of this is inflated by geographic biases. For example, if you want to see the highest paid engineers in the country, they're all in Texas and Louisiana around the oil and gas industry. You want to find the highest paid teachers? Well, they're all coming out of colleges in New York City. Or if you want to look around the DC area, colleges in that area tend to have higher wages because of their proximity and they're making more money because of the high cost of living. There is not an adjustment for that currently. The other thing though is, this is a great talking point I think for your state. The differences in salary are very minimal for the most part. Can you justify going out of state when you can make similar amounts of money and pay in-state rates? So a lot of cases, the degree is important, the credential is important, where you got it from maybe not as much so. Now obviously we want to find fit and other things like that, but the other thing that you can do is with the flows data, is you can look at where people are in the country, what industries they go into, and even look at combinations of things like this. So we're looking in the state of Iowa, which industries retain the most number of Regent University graduates. It's no big surprise that agriculture, we're an agriculture state, but also finance and insurance, which is one of our biggest industries. And they bring in people from all over the country, so our wages are very high in those areas, and so it's very attractive to stay. You can also see where in the country those students are going. Now, this is looking at census division, which is the current way of being able to look at these data. However, we're getting ready to be able to start showing this by state, so you can see where your students are going when they leave. One of the things that I talked about last time I was here, we expected that when people leave our state, they're going to the coasts, beaches, warm weather, that sort of thing. We have like 80% staying within the Midwest, which is great for being able to try to recruit people back to Iowa. Again, they're not leaving the area. We can try to pull them back in. Now, this is showing 5 years after graduation, or I'll show a little bit later, 10 years after graduation, we have we have about 50% of our students stay in the state of Iowa, of our graduates stay in the state of Iowa. And that doesn't seem great. However, you have to keep in mind that 40% of our graduates came from out of state. So a lot of cases, they're going back. And one of the things that we are adding into the Census project, because this is a very grassroots organization, it is we as a collective are kind of driving the agenda and working with the Census Bureau to add more and more things. We are adding residency at the time of starting at your education. So we'll start to be able to see what percent of our Iowa residents stayed in state and which left, and what percent of our out-of-state students decided to go back to their own state or decide to stay in Iowa. We've got a great program of bringing in tens of thousands of students every year from other states, and we actually retain some of them. It's a great process for trying to bring in some of the great minds around the country and keep them in the state of Iowa. So now we're moving into the more experimental stuff. So not many people have seen this. We are starting to work with kind of workforce alignment review and try to get at some of the return on investment questions that we have in our state. Our legislature tasked us with doing a workforce alignment review for all of our majors to all the kind of state occupations. And one of the first ways we're looking at this is we're bringing in the Bureau of Labor Statistics and Iowa workforce development data to kind of match our majors to occupations in the state and nationally. Now, this is very vanilla. I would say in a lot of cases, the occupations we're talking about here are stereotypes. For example, I mean, the first one is mechanical engineering again. The bottom one is for philosophy. They only list kind of 4 major professions or 4 major occupations for mechanical engineers. And obviously we know mechanical engineers are working in lots of other areas besides that. It does, however, give us a chance to match the number of graduates we have in our programs to the number of job openings in the state, to the median wages that are available, and the growth that's available. So it's not a perfect measure by any stretch of the imagination. And when I talk about stereotypes, philosophy is a pretty big one here. The stereotype being the only thing you can do with a philosophy degree is get a PhD and teach other philosophy majors. And that's what this particular crosswalk would have you believe. Again, not perfect, we're getting at part of the story. But if we bring in some of the data from the American Community Survey, which is another census project, we can look at, within the state of Iowa, for example, students who have a bachelor's degree in philosophy or religious studies, what are some of the occupations and industries that they're working in? And it is all over the map. In addition to that, so we've got doctors, you've got clergy, you've got folks that are working in computer networking. In addition to that, we can use the Census PSEO data to look at the industries where those graduates are going. So if you've got an undergraduate degree in education, 92% of those students are working in the education field. That makes sense. Engineering tends to be more in manufacturing within our state. Other states have different kind of mixes along those lines, but you can see the spread and variety of where those engineering students are working. And if we look at philosophy and religious studies, while the Bureau of Labor Statistics would say 100% are going into education, we can see that only 19% are going into education. It's a reminder that a philosophy degree, it doesn't have the same technical know-how that engineering has. It doesn't have some of the pay, but it's a great major for learning how to think, learning how to learn, and you can apply that to lots of different fields. We're also looking at return on investment as part of this workforce alignment, and there are lots of things to choose from out there. One of them being, in this case, would be the Georgetown Center for Education in the Workplace. It's a straightforward, it's a simple measure. It really gets at kind of like, can you pay off the cost of college over a period of time? And their formula is looking, in this case, is 10 years after high school graduation. They ignore the first 5 years because those are the 5 years spent getting a bachelor's degree. They then count all your earnings together for the next 5 years afterward. And then they also subtract out average net price, which we talked about earlier, times 5, which would be kind of the generalized conservative assumption for how many years of college it took to get that bachelor's degree. We're doing a revised version of that, where we're being able to we're looking at years after degree rather than years after high school, but using a very similar methodology. And we can look at the actual time to degree by major, and we can plug that into the formula and customize it even more for our students. In addition, the Georgetown Center had to, by necessity, use college scorecard data. That's the best way of getting at this kind of the wage data nationally. But only about 40 to 50% of students are kind of in that data pool, at least for our students, because that's how many are taking federal loan debt. And it only looks at 1 to 2 years, typically, of graduate cohorts. Within Census PSEO, we have 22 years of our graduates, all adjusted to 2022 dollars. So a much more robust data set. And we can then plug in the data that we're getting from Census PSEO into this formula instead. There's other ways of looking at return on investment, and one that we like, it's relatively easy to explain, but it's the University of Texas system. This is David Troutman again. Minimum economic return. So the premise behind this is, can a student, after graduating from college, pay off their student loan debts, and they amortize that over a 10-year period with interest? Can they pay off those debts and still make more than a high school graduate? So what we've done is we've put some of this in here. You can see some of the calculation. Hopefully it's readable for where you're at. What we have in here, we've got the median income for high school graduates for the state of Iowa. It's at age 25 using the American Community Survey. So we have the annual loan payment. This is very high. This is not reflective of a typical loan payment. However, the formula that the Texas system was using was basically a multiplier of net price times time to degree. It's just basically assuming that the student is taking loans out for everything. And we know that about 40 to 50% of our students graduate with no debt whatsoever. So this is a bit an exaggeration, but for the purposes, we can see how that would kind of go together. That creates the minimum economic threshold of around 42,000, depending on the major, the net price of the university, and the time to degree. And then we can see next to that, one-year earnings after college. This is from Census PSEO, and the earnings 5 years after degree, also from Census PSEO. So the thing that we have added to this kind of idea is, how many years does it take to reach that minimum threshold? So for an engineering student, across the board, first year, you've kind of crossed that threshold. You can pay off all your debts, you're making a lot more than a high school grad. For philosophy, it's 4 years. Now, we have a few majors that take 7 years, and we have one that takes 8. That is the worst we have, 8 years to break even, and that is the classical literature that we talked about earlier. But these are some of the things we're putting together in a very large report that we're going to send to our legislature to help them try to understand where we're coming from and how we're trying to meet the needs of our students and of the workforce for the state of Iowa. And then finally, I'm just going to share 2 quick slides that show how we're trying to operationalize publicly some of this data. These are on the Iowa Board of Regents website. The first is really just a repackaging of the PSEO data. Overall, the PSEO data can be very complicated. The Census Bureau has a great website to kind of show some of these data visualizations. We wanted to do something with one page that kind of got at some of the very basics. So for every kind of academic field, in this case it's a 2-digit zip code, we can show where are the students after graduation, what industries are they working in, what wages are they earning, all at a glance. And then 2 years ago, our legislature passed a law saying that we needed to be able to show wages, for which we use census data, debt, for which we're using college scorecard, percentage of our graduates, and these are all at the 4-digit zip code level, so it's pretty close to individual major level, and the percent that are going on to get masters or PhDs within 10 years after graduating from their bachelor's degree. So this is a good example of how we're combining multiple data sets together to try to get at a better picture for our students. We are required to share this every semester with our new students as they're coming in. So we start off by sharing with all of our current undergraduate students. And as every new class comes in, this gets sent out to them as well, so they can go in, the idea being they're still at a place where they're trying to figure out what major they want to have, and this allows them to kind of make a comparison. They could go in with eyes wide open. They probably knew, again, computer science makes more, but they may not have realized statistics makes almost as much as computer science. And with that, I'll entertain any questions folks have.
I have a question.
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
So where do you see this being applied, particularly at 7th, 8th, and 9th grade level students? I mean, giving them the information they need to make decisions, maybe even further back in the pipeline, but at least 7th, 8th, 9th grade.
Yeah, so in the state of Iowa, we have, probably most states have this, but we have an academic plan they have to submit in 8th grade before going into high school, and we've been trying to use this data more with the high school so that they're aware of it. The data from the PSEO also gets used quite a lot by our career services staff, as far as helping students understand what major they want to be in or what some of their expected outcomes, or even we use it in certain situations for what should you be negotiating for a salary when you're out in the job market.
I had Blake Flanders from Kansas. It's eerie how our data are so similar across the states when you showed those trends. I'm interested in your thoughts when you discussed college cost. So we're seeing the same trends. Our community colleges, even though they had a small bounce this last year, really in the last 10 years, we've seen a decrease in about 29% of their enrollments. And the regional universities and research universities, if you aggregate those data, they've been about flat in terms of enrollment, with the research universities actually growing some and the regional universities dropping some enrollment. So we talk about college cost, but students are clearly choosing the options that are the highest price. So how do you reconcile those numbers?
Yeah, a couple things. One is I think there's an awful lot of students that are just dropping out of the system and not going to college at all. We've seen, again, with our community college drop, we did some of the research, some statistical modeling, and it looks like with the concurrent enrollment or the dual enrollment, we're actually, the more dual enrollment the students are taking, setting everything else being equal, they're more likely to go to a four-year institution. So the community colleges in some ways are maybe hurting themselves with kind of the abundance of that available. And I would say the reason we're seeing so many folks going to some of the more expensive schools is typically what it is like if there's a high cost for college and you're not sure college is worth it, you're going to go for the biggest name brand you can get or can afford, particularly, again, that in-state sort of flagship institution. And there are some folks that are able to and willing to pay that premium for like an Ivy League type institution if their student can get in. But I think of the pool that's left, more of them are trying to go for the name brand, which I think is also hurting some of our regional publics as well. But I haven't figured out all the answers either.
So just to follow up, we did look at some wage data. We tracked that by unit record. And the earnings, as an example, for a business administration degree, if I just on my phone selected 3 of our universities, 2 were regionals, 1 was a research university.
Yep.
They were earning almost the same year 1, anywhere from 42 to 46,000. But in year 5, if they were at the research university, they all of a sudden climbed to over 90,000, where the others were in the 60s. Could be geography, but these are essentially students who are in Kansas or Missouri, and so it wouldn't be as large influence. So there may be something to the fact that name brand is providing.
And there's 2 other things that are probably factoring into that. It's like, so University of Northern Iowa for some of their majors looks lower than Iowa State and Iowa. You can even see that at teacher education. And we know for a fact that the teachers in the state of Iowa are not being paid differentially based on where they got their degree. But we know that more of the students from Iowa and Iowa State are leaving the state. And we're not a particularly high wage state, at least compared to like going to Chicago or Kansas City or some other areas where they could go. So UNI looks lower because they have more Iowa residents to begin with, and they retain more of those Iowa residents, and they're working in state. The other thing I would say is there's probably, and this I haven't been able to test, there's probably a likelihood that more of those students at the research ones are going on to grad school later, and that's going to bump their earnings. And that is something that is part of this Census PSEO. They're using a median to try to get rid of those outliers, but sometimes additional degrees can bump that salary up.
Excellent presentation. You spoke at UW-Madison, I think, the last time, if I'm remembering
Yep.
right, and I was so impressed then. I'm from Wisconsin. I work with the private colleges. I'm just wondering how many private colleges are participating in this, or what's your sense? Is it growing? And we're not going to do deals with individual colleges, so it's going to have to be our association in Wisconsin that kind of pushes the schools to participate. But what are you seeing in that regard?
Yeah. And I honestly, I blame MEC for my kid going to Wisconsin-Madison, because he was with me when we presented last time, and he visited the campus and fell in love.
Well, we're happy. Well, when you're at the Union and that beautiful view, it's hard to give it up. But of course, I don't work at UW-Madison. But we're
Right.
glad that your son came to Wisconsin. Thank you.
Right. As far as the privates, we have lined up, again, probably 10 of our 20 or so privates in the state that are planning on working with us for doing the PSEO. It is a bit of a challenge, and it takes a little bit of trust on their part to give us the data. And we're doing MOUs between each one of them to kind of promise that we're not using their data in any way nefarious and that we are deleting it right away. I think we have that trust because they see the benefit of this data. There are a number of other states, depending on the data or the structure of how they're governed. So like Virginia with their SHEV has all of their institutions in there. Minnesota has all the privates and publics together in one place. Indiana, because they've got one organization that can pull all the graduate data together in one place, can do it. And we're doing it piecemeal, which is what a lot of other states are probably going to have to do. But if you can find a trusted partner with maybe one of the larger institutions or with one of the other organizations, maybe they can make that work. Ooh.
Fascinating, of course, again. And I have a question about the vocational programs and where would they fit into these data? Or are they just removed from these data?
Vocational programs, how for?
Like tech colleges.
Oh, yeah. Since I'm working from the Board of Regents perspective, I'm only showing data mostly for bachelor's degrees. But within the Census PSEO, you can get 1-year certificates, 1 to 2-year certificates, associate degrees.
And so you just remove that information from there?
For what I'm doing, for what I was showing was mostly for our 3 public universities. But we do have comparisons, and our last time I presented, I did show retention rates by university within the state. And we've actually got some of our community colleges have a lower in-state retention of their graduates than our regent universities do, but it's often because they're kind of on the edges of the state. They're close to Nebraska or Illinois, and so the students are then leaving to go to the other state. So we have all that data, and a lot of the community colleges across the country are participating in PSEO. So most states that have PSEO are also putting in community college and technical college data. So it's there. I just wasn't covering that just because I'm my personal bias working with the board office.
Well, I was just wondering if they would fit into the community college data. And that I was, yeah, for the 2 years. And then I was really wondering about the decline in enrollment for those community college, technical college programs, junior programs,
Oh yeah, the decline I was showing earlier was the high school graduates who intended to go to a 2-year college and get a community college or technical degree.
Okay. Can I have one other question? Oh,
Sure.
I just got turned on. Yeah. The dual enrollment information, could you say more about that? Because it was to me, it was kind of like
It was a blur.
jumble, right?
Yeah. So our average is right around 20 credits per student coming into our regent universities from Iowa high schools. And keep in mind that 20 takes into account all the zeros. So there are students with no concurrent credit who are coming into our university. So that average is actually depressed by that. I should have gone back to pull it, but it's probably averaging around 25 college credits when they walk in the door as a high school graduate to our universities. And what we're trying to do is match, again, like the high school course data to so we can see what a student took in high school and match that to what they're taking in college and look to see how they're using some of those credits. So if they tested out of, or credit, I got credit out of calculus, did they retake calculus? Did they jump to the next level of calculus? How did they perform? Was there a difference between taking a class dual enrollment versus AP versus honors at their high school? Typically, no. So we're able to look at some of those things. The problem is course data gets messy really fast, and so we've been focusing mostly on the math and how that dual credit translates into performance at our schools. We're starting to look at maybe physics and chemistry, because there has been some indication that students that are testing out of essentially entry-level chemistry and physics often are a disadvantage when they get to our universities. At least that's an observation from some of our faculty, so we're going to go back and try to test that as well.
And you haven't looked at the dual enrollment in some of the other kind of 101 courses, other than math and science?
We know which courses that students are taking for dual enrollment, and we know what are the main kind of topics or courses that are taken across the state. We haven't looked as much of like English to English or kind of science to science. We're only been looking at the math as far as that kind of tying into high school credits to college credits.
So I'll stay tuned.
Sorry?
So I'll stay tuned.
Yeah, stay tuned.
I was interested in the dual, thank you very much, enrollment as well. But a lot of information in higher ed is very controversial in many ways. If I use the University of Kansas, of which I'm a faculty member, we had the largest freshman enrollment this year ever. And we've been around since 1800. Mm-hmm. So we're looking at that. But we also are looking at enrollment of students in terms of parents that attended college.
Right.
What's that percentage? And what's the percentage of the students where parents did not attend college in many ways? And the big one we're looking at is actually the debt. It has increased substantially since universities began to use credit cards. When they were paying just for their enrollment, it became an interesting, or you had time to pay. Have you looked at any of that in terms of how credit card and also dual enrollment, where people take 2 and 3? I had a student intern, was a triple major. How that has played into it.
Yeah, no, we are definitely seeing more double majors for folks that are bringing in those dual credit or the dual enrollment credits. As far as looking at, so you were asking about kind of like first generation college students. We haven't looked at that as far as the dual credit side of things, if that's what you're asking. Maybe I may have missed the second part of your question.
Well, when I look at the dual enrollment, it's like where you go, but in terms of parents, what we have found so far, that for students where parents did not attend college, it's almost a 50-50 split.
Okay.
Because their parents, because they didn't go, they want their children to attend.
Right.
Or because their parents didn't go, they don't think it's necessary, you can do something else.
Right.
So we're trying to think that enrollment is really kind of dicey in many ways, and where some are increasing, others are not. So therefore people say they're not going to college, and that's not really true.
Right. Yeah, and that's not something we've looked at quite as much. We do look at across the state where students have access to dual credit, which is actually pretty widespread in our state. But if you look at like AP credit, for example, as a counterpoint, relatively few of our schools in the rural areas have AP, but they do have the community college nearby to offer the concurrent or the dual credit. I'm not sure I've answered your question very well, but.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.